Hey everyone, welcome to this week's content module. I'm really excited today to be talking to you about a subject that is near and dear to my cold, dead political scientist heart, a topic that's very foundational to much of the research that I do in the field of voting behavior, and a topic that's very foundational in the field in general, and that is performance voting, or the idea that people can appraise the situation around them, the real world around them, and then make some kind of judgment about the performance of a politician in order to make a voting decision as to whether or not to keep them in office or not. And so, as we start talking about this subject, I really want to pose some foundational questions. Maybe ask a couple of questions, just to get us started. And really, to ground that discussion, I want to go back to some debates that were being had in political theory circles around the founding of the United States. People like Alexander Hamilton were fighting people like Thomas Jefferson and other, founding fathers or framers of the Constitution. Anti-federalists were fighting federalists on some of these key issues related to whether or not democracy itself was a good idea. And anti-federalists, despite having a set of opinions on this matter that would, begin in, slightly closer to the Federalists, maybe move into a more radical direction over time. Despite that kind of opposition, a lot of people at that time really thought that this idea of full-fledged democracy was a really scary and bad idea. And that is because they thought that it would almost inevitably devolve without limits into what we might call a mobocracy, mob rule, where people with essentially no political understanding or awareness or sophistication would sort of run amok and start to break the institutions that have been set up to help democracy flourish. And really kind of the debate that carried forward from that time was a debate about public opinion itself. Whether or not this, unruly mob that we might call the American public, right, the mobocracy that today we have institutionalized in universal suffrage, right, whether or not people can express themselves meaningfully in the modern sense or not. So this, from the founding to now, really that basic question has, I think, boiled down to this question of whether or not the public is informed enough to be able to say anything meaningful, or whether their opinions are kind of just random noise and the influence of like things they might have heard from a neighbor or a friend or from the media. And I think that insight, right, this question ties into some of the foundational literature that, if you had taken my public opinion class, you may be reading here as a review. Some of the early findings showed that Americans' opinions are just really all over the place. They're very disorganized. They're not particularly ideological in nature, except for a very few Americans who are really able to piece that whole story together. Most Americans are simply not political enough to have these very consistent, tightly bundled issue positions that we might think of as being ideologies. And so while that's changing over time, and Americans are starting to figure out that these issue positions go together generally to adopt either sort of conservative or liberal general worldviews, it's still the case that a lot of Americans just simply don't know enough about politics to understand that one conservative issue position goes with another and a third and a fourth, or a liberal issue position goes with the second, third, or fourth liberal issue position. And so the majority of Americans really are just all over the map when it comes to politics. So we think about this, we can also go back to the questions of sort of foundational political knowledge, right? Do Americans understand how their government works? And, for those of you who have, taken Intro to American Politics with me, you obviously do not count as part of this group of Americans that might not understand the system. But as we might imagine, there's a lot of people out there who have really a fuzzy understanding of like the systems of checks and balances, federalism, especially, the relationship between the federal government and state and local governments. Americans have a really sort of fuzzy picture of sort of how this all fits together in many respects. And that also, I think, means that this is another sort of check against or mark against their ability to sort of reason their way through the voting decision. So public competency, they might not be particularly ideological, and they also might not know a lot about institutions. Also, we could also go further and say, what about citizens' civic skills? Their ability to sort of actually grapple with the world of politics, to actually go sort of knock on the door and say, hey, I have a grievance. I want some kind of restitution. the question I have on the slide here is, can Mr. Smith make it to Washington without directions, right? Is it possible for the average American to find out who's responsible for some sort of thing that went wrong in their world, and then, actually go and contact the right person and get some help? So from the perspective of ideology, civic skills, and basic understanding of the fundamental institutions, we might be pretty lacking, right? And then another perspective we might think of is political sophistication, which is, can citizens make smart judgments about how the whole thing fits together? Can they reason through how, like, a political decision, right? Say, like a decision to, engage in some kind of like tax cut or something. Can they see that policy has like these consequences? Maybe that means that their tax burden at the end of the year is slightly smaller, or maybe it's not changed, or maybe other policy consequences have happened as a result of that unbalanced budget. The ability to reason through this like whole system from beginning to end is also, I think, a core way that we can think about whether or not Americans are kind of up to the task of doing democracy. And so as I talk through this, like, there's a huge literature that I'm kind of reviewing in extremely vague detail right now. So just take it right now as simply just a review of the somewhat dismal findings that, like, many political scientists have come to terms with over the decades about the fact simply that Americans don't know a lot about politics, are very interested in politics, and often really struggle to connect all the dots. And then, we've mentioned this as well, right? This question of civic engagement. Are Americans tuned into politics, or have they dropped out? And certainly the answer to that question is that if you really don't understand much of what's going on in the world of politics right now, it's very unlikely that you'll find it to be particularly compelling in a way that would make you want to consume more politics, right? Modern research has really shown that this is another way in which American society is polarizing, where we have many Americans who are coming to become hyper political, and they spend all day and all night thinking about politics and their favorite candidates and their favorite parties. And then another group of Americans who just have found every possible excuse to remove themselves from some of those political discussions. So we have both a tuning in that's happening over time, and a group for whom dropping out makes a lot more sense. So political scientists spend a lot of time, and actually many of them, I think, spend a lot of time trying to justify why some of those foundational observations weren't really the story, right? Trying to sort of preserve this notion that democracy is still possible with an inattentive and sort of poorly politically educated public. And so from this period, right, we had sort of theories that that took issues as their center. So issue voting. This is kind of the idea that voters look at different issues that are relevant to their lives, and they decide whether or not to vote for a candidate on the basis of that candidate's understanding of those issues. And so I ask you here, you can pause the slide, you can ponder this, right? Given what I've just mentioned, right? Given this sort of many faceted, many layered sort of set of reasons why Americans aren't particularly sophisticated when it comes to political engagement, what do we think about this idea, right? Does it make sense to us that the average voter thinks about their, and of course I'll use one of the absolute most basic, most original issue positions. Does it make sense to think that somebody looks at their own stance on the abortion issue and then looks to the two candidates and says, okay, whichever candidate aligns with my issue position on this issue of abortion, that's the candidate that I'm going to vote for? Pause that slide for a second and think about it for a second. So I hope that you got a chance to think about this, and I hope that you came to maybe some conflicting conclusions, because really, certainly there are examples that we could maybe think of, right? There's people even on the op-ed pages of some prominent newspapers who might even fall under that rubric, who would say, look, for me, the one and only issue here is this issue of abortion. You can't sway me any other way, right? The world could literally be on fire. And if the candidate who has caused the world to be on fire is still somebody who aligns with my issue position on abortion, I'm going to vote for them, right? However, we also have to contend with the fact that we've got a lot of Americans out there who don't know enough about the issues to be able to be real issue voters, right? And that's kind of the point I want to drive home here, is that Issue voting places a burden on citizens because it assumes that they know a lot of stuff. The first being that the citizen has to have an opinion about the issue, right? They have to say, oh yeah, I'm a staunch proponent in balanced budgets, right? Okay, that's knowing what we know about the American public, that's already a select group of people who would even know what we're talking about, right? Number two, the citizen must know current government policy on the issue. They need to know how that issue has been handled by the incumbent. Three, and this is a really important point here, the citizen needs to know the alternative. So they need to be aware that the other candidate isn't espousing the same issue position. And they need to know that this other candidate has made a clear stance that says, oh yeah, the incumbent's been doing this, I'm going to do the opposite. That's not a guarantee, even in a polarized political environment. And then finally, right, the citizen has to care enough about this so that other issue considerations don't overwhelm that sort of impetus to vote on the basis of that issue. So if you think about it, right, like if you really think about how does issue voting work, we've got our anecdote about the like single issue abortion voter, but like that person is probably pretty rare, given that there's so many other people who fail to meet these four criteria for issue voting to function. So the takeaway from this whole discussion is that many Americans are what we might call sort of rationally ignorant when it comes to politics. They don't like to engage in politics, and we can't blame them for it, essentially. It makes sense why they wouldn't be interested in knowing about politics. It's contentious, it's horrible, and if you don't understand the basics, you haven't had the civic education to know how it works, it's very like kaleidoscopic and makes no sense. The consequence of that, logical consequence, is that issue voting is really, really hard to do for many people. So that's the first thing that I wanted to sort of make clear in this discussion, and I'm going to sort of end this module video, and we'll pick up in the next video and think about what scholars might have asserted in response to the discovery, essentially, that issue voting is just really, really hard.